Okay, so I have to tell you, a couple weeks ago, when Jeff came into my office and he asked me if I would be willing to share with you all, a few things flooded into my mind right away. Some of them I'm going to share with you, and some of them I'm not. But the first thing was this. I thought, Jeff, do you know whose office you're in right now? And the second thing, I thought, well, where's BJ and Fred and Dave? Where are they all going that they didn't invite me to go with them, that they need me to preach this week? And then the third thing I thought was this. If everybody's going somewhere and they didn't invite me, maybe I am the right person to speak on loneliness. No, but seriously, I count it as a great honor and a privilege to share with you all this morning. So over the next couple of weeks, as we get into this new sermon series, we're going to be going on a journey together that is going to call for both vulnerability and grace as we explore elements of our personal lives that we often try really, really hard to keep hidden. As we examine the topics of loneliness, depression, anxiety, and addiction, it's going to require a lot of each and every one of us. We're going to have the opportunity, you guys, over the next several weeks to share pieces of ourselves we often try to hide. We're also going to have the opportunity to approach one another with grace and humility and love as we talk about some of these topics. My hope that today, wherever you're at on your spiritual journey, that this message will be informational, it'll be helpful, it'll be encouraging, but most of all, I hope that it'll just draw you a little bit closer to God and to one another. So, to say that loneliness is a big deal is a huge understatement. A quick Google search of the topic results in countless news articles and studies that point to what is now being referred to as a loneliness epidemic in Western culture today. According to a research that was done last year by the healthcare company Cigna, nearly half of all Americans report sometimes or always feeling lonely. 1 in 4 Americans rarely or never feel that there are people who really and truly understand them. 2 in 5 Americans, or 43%, sometimes or always feel that their relationships are not meaningful and that they feel isolated from others. And around half of all Americans, around half of all Americans have meaningful interactions on a daily basis with friends and family. That means half of all Americans don't. And then a more recent article is saying that Generation Z, the upcoming generation now, is the loneliest generation in history. There was another article released by Time magazine in April of last year that said research has shown that young Americans, approximately 22 to 38, I am just barely hanging on to that age demographic, are struggling with record high rates of issues like depression, anxiety, and loneliness. Harvard professor of public policy Robert Putnam, in his groundbreaking book, Bowling Alone, which he released in 2001, explores the way in which society has continued to become more and more isolated. And as a result, we are experiencing record low levels of social capital. So a good working definition of social capital is this. Social capital is the networks of relationships among people who live and work in a particular society, enabling that society to function effectively. Here are a few of the most staggering statistics Putnam has observed over the last 25 years. Some of this is even since he released that book. The attendance of club meetings such as Rotary or Elks or Masons or these kind of clubs has gone down by 58% in the last 25 years. Families sitting down and having meals together has gone down by 43% in the last 25 years. And households having friends or neighbors come over to join them for a meal every once in a while has gone down by 35% in the last 25 years. You know, as I was discussing this sermon earlier this week with BJ, our executive minister, he shared a story with me. He said that several years ago, when he was serving as the student minister, he had an event at our community center in Mooresville, and he said there was about 100 kids there, and he said he posed this question to them. He said, how many of you have at least one meal where you sit down as a family and eat together on a weekly basis? He told me that 5 kids raised their hand. 5 kids. Now, who knows? Maybe they were distracted. Maybe they didn't hear him clearly. But that's staggering. And that's families mostly made up from our church. Our current state of loneliness is a big deal, not only to our mental health, but to our physical health as well. The previous Surgeon General, Dr. Vivek Murthy, who was one of the first to officially call loneliness an epidemic in the United States, he states that loneliness can cause chronic stress that leads to inflammation and an increased risk of heart disease, arthritis, and diabetes. One recent study found that extreme loneliness has the same effect on our health as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. Another study from the University of Florida, College of Medicine, this study involved over 12,000 individuals over a 10-year span, so this was a big study. It concluded this. It said that extreme isolation and loneliness can cause our risk of getting dementia to increase by 40%. 40%. Of course, the effects of loneliness are not just personal, meaning affecting our physical and mental health, but they're societal as well. Putnam also observed, he said this, school performance, public health, crime rates, clinical depression, tax compliance, philanthropy, race relations, community development, census returns, teen suicide, economic productivity, campaign finance, and even simple human happiness are demonstrably affected by how or whether we connect with our family and friends and neighbors and community. I believe it's so crucial for us to gain an understanding of our current state of loneliness because not only does this affect everything that I've just talked about, but it is a huge foundational contributing factor to everything we're going to talk about over the next several weeks. Loneliness is key in anxiety and depression and addiction. How are we doing? Good morning, right? Welcome. Just cheering you up. Okay. So if you guys will stick with me a little bit longer, I want to present to you what I believe are 2 of the main cultural contributors to this epidemic of loneliness we're experiencing. And then I'm going to dive in and give you a couple truths and then a couple things from the life of Jesus that are really going to help us move forward and be a light in the darkness. The first significant cultural cause of loneliness is our individualism. In many ways, our country was founded on this sort of individualistic mentality. It was sort of breaking free from England, and it was this pull ourselves up by our bootstraps mentality, which is not inherently a bad thing, and a lot of the wonderful things we enjoy are a result of that. But too much is proving to be a bad thing. Individualism is a political and social philosophy that emphasizes the moral worth of the individual. So in other words, instead of we over me, individualism is me over we. Cross-cultural psychologists often study the differences and similarities between individualistic cultures and collectivist cultures. Individualistic cultures are those that stress the needs of the individual over the needs of the group as a whole. In individualistic cultures, people are considered good if they are strong, self-reliant, assertive, and independent. However, in a collectivist culture, characteristics like being self-sacrificing, dependable, generous, and helpful to others is of greater importance. Oftentimes, in individualistic cultures, somebody will describe themselves as saying, I am smart, I am brave, I am intelligent. And in collectivist cultures, somebody would describe themselves in this way. They would say, I am a good father and husband. I'm a good neighbor. I'm a responsible member of my community. Do you guys see the difference in that? Michael Hendricks, in his article in the National Review, which he titled Lonely America, had the following to say: family, faith, and community, the reserves of liberty, have suffered tremendous losses, particularly since the 1960s and 1970s. It turns out that you do you is disorienting to anyone who lacks dense social networks and deep wells of social capital to draw from. The result is that we have set loose a scourge of loneliness and isolation that we are still afraid to acknowledge as the distinct social dysfunction of our age of individualism. We live in an increasingly individualistic culture. But when I read the Bible and I look at the early church and I look at the way it describes the way they lived life with one another, that looks a lot more collectivist to me. You know, I think when Jesus commanded us to love our neighbors, he was inviting us into relationship with one another, to this sort of communal living. The second significant cultural cause of loneliness is our engagement with technology. I'm fully aware I might get some of you guys mad at me here, but let's just stick with it together. I'm not saying technology isn't inherently bad, but we live in a world where technological advancements are happening so quickly that we don't even have time to process what the long-term effects are on us as a culture. Elena Blanco Suarez, who holds a PhD in brain chemistry, wrote the following in a Psychology Today article: loneliness is an epidemic. We are going through times of profound social change, and the internet and other new social technologies are huge drivers of this epidemic, allowing us to remain in touch with others without actually having to connect with them. A lot of us spend far more time observing the lives of friends and family through social media and through different technology than we do sitting down and living lives with them. We have more access to people than ever before, you guys, but we are connected with fewer and fewer people than ever before. I'll be turning 37 later this month, and my generation is really the last generation to have grown up without the internet and mobile technology. Think about that. I can still remember when I was like in junior high, and we got AOL internet for the first time in the big computer cabinet that was in our front room, and it was the slow dial-up that you could hear. You know, you've got mail. And I can still remember getting a cell phone for the first time in high school, but it was really like a brick, really. You know, it had numbers, and it just made phone calls. By the way, if you guys are not aware, your phone can make phone calls. But that didn't have apps. I couldn't send pictures. I couldn't send text messages. It just allowed me to make calls. But now it's not uncommon for kids as early as second or third grade, or maybe even younger, to be given smartphones that give them access to the internet to connect with peers and adults in ways that is unsupervised. A photographer by the name of Eric Pickersgill has created a series of photos that I'm going to share with you in a minute, and these are fascinating. What he has done is he's captured moments from everyday life and then removed the phone from the people there. Let's just take a look. That slays me, you guys. That last picture with the kid standing there, we are so distracted by our technology that we are missing the opportunity to connect with our friends and family in a meaningful way. Our kids are growing up in environments where they're not learning how to have an uninterrupted conversation because there's always a notification going off or somebody scrolling through social media. They don't know what it's like to just talk with somebody for a couple of minutes without that person being completely distracted. You know, I recently read this article that infants are starting to fall behind on their neurological development, because a big part of how infants develop is through nonverbal, sort of microfacial expressions. So sometimes, you've probably experienced this in a conversation with somebody. You'll see like a look on their mouth or their eye, or notice that you realize they're feeling something about what you're saying, but they haven't said anything. Those, it turns out, are hugely important in infant development. And so now, and I was guilty of this with both of my kids at times when they were little, when we sit and we're rocking our kid to sleep and we're looking through, checking ESPN or Instagram or whatever it may be, we are depriving them of seeing our faces, which is incredibly important to their development. I think if we want to help upcoming generations battle the ever-increasing loneliness epidemic, we have to be willing to model intentional relationships and interruption-free social exchanges. That means putting your phone in the freezer or the refrigerator or whatever you have to do. Turning off notifications if you need to during family time. You know, some of the best things we can do for our kids and upcoming generations, just sit down and have dinner together and invite people into our lives so they see us building relationships. It's okay if they see us awkwardly fumbling through how to meet a new person. That's extremely beneficial for their development. My brother-in-law is a pastor at a church in Fort Wayne. He's an incredible spiritual mentor to me. But he shared this with me. He said a while ago he stopped altogether going through the drive-thru at Starbucks because he realized it was preventing him from connecting with the people who work there. And he's a very relational guy. It's one of the many things I admire about him. But he said, I started working time into my schedule so I could park and go in so that I could have that exchange, that simple exchange of ordering the drink and maybe even having to talk with somebody in line. I think that's the kind of intentionality we need to have sometimes with our technology. There's an art to being able to build and form relationships and socially interact with people well. And if we're not modeling that to the people in our lives, it really might be detrimental to their futures. Okay, this is the first truth I want to leave with you all today. We were created by community for community. In Genesis 1:26a, it says this, "Then God said, 'Let us make man in our image after our likeness.'" Notice the unique wording there. It says, "in our image after our likeness." Now, there are various different theological interpretations about what's actually going on here. Some theologians have said this is really an early pointing to the concept that would later come to be known as the Trinity, that God exists as the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Other theologians think that maybe what really happened here was that God created us while a council of holy hosts or angels was watching. Whatever the interpretation of this moment is, that's really not the point. What is that regardless of the interpretation, one thing is very, very clear. Our very existence is a byproduct of a relational harmony and community. We were created for community. In Genesis 2:18, it says this, "Then the Lord said, 'It is not good that man should be alone. I will make him a helper fit for him.'" This verse is really intriguing to me. I think the timing of the statement is key. See, Adam, at this moment, I want you guys to think about this. This is pre-serpent, pre-fall. This is Adam living in perfect harmony with God. And God observes that something is missing, that it's not good for Adam not to have interpersonal relationship with another human being. I love the way that former pastors Richard Plass and James Cofield describe in their book, The Relational Soul, how our loneliness points to our relational design. This is what they write. "Be it chronic or acute, slight or significant, loneliness is proof of our relational design. At the core of our being is this truth. We are designed for and defined by our relationships." And then they go on later in the book to say this. "We were born with a relentless longing to participate in the lives of others. Fundamentally, we are relational souls. If the first man and woman ever created who lived in a perfect, sinless relationship with God, also needed their relationship with one another to be whole, guys, how much more do we, living in a fallen world full of darkness and broken relationships, need not only first and primarily our relationship with God, but also our relationship with one another? It's no coincidence to me that the phrase one another, it literally appears 100 times in the New Testament. I think there's something in that for us. We were created by community for community. The second truth I want you guys to walk away with today is this: we are not alone in our loneliness. Statistically, almost half of everybody in this room, or half of everybody we encounter on a daily basis, are dealing in some way with the effects of loneliness. In this room right now, there are seniors who live alone, and maybe that moment of coming to church today is the only time all week they're going to interact with somebody. There are spouses who have recently lost a loved one and who are dealing with an empty home right now. There are parents who just sent their last child off to college and are dealing with the effects of an empty nest for the first time. There are husbands and wives who are going through a divorce, or maybe they're living separately, or maybe they're living in the same house, but really they're living two separate lives. There are single people who either desperately want to find someone to connect with, or they desperately just want to find a community to connect with as well. There are people who are hurting and feel like the hurt that they have experienced, no one else can understand, and they are sitting alone in their loneliness. There are kids and students in here right now that maybe sit alone at lunch, and they just desperately want someone to come over, extend a hand to them, talk with them, and pull them out of their isolation. And believe it or not, there are teens here that, even though they would never say it, desperately just want some uninterrupted time with mom and dad. We are lonely, but we are not alone in our loneliness. The Bible is filled with individuals who experience seasons of intense loneliness. If you look at the Old Testament, you see Moses, Job, Nehemiah, Elijah, and Jeremiah. They all felt extreme isolation at times. And then the King David, who wrote a significant portion of the Psalms, he wrote this in Psalm 25, verse 6 through 18. He said, "Turn to me and be gracious to me, for I am lonely and afflicted. The troubles of my heart are enlarged. Bring me out of my distress." And then in the New Testament, we see the Apostle Paul. He was extremely lonely when he was locked in a Roman prison for sharing the gospel and the good news. The Apostle John, he was exiled to an island, a Greek island, all by himself. These characters that we see and interact with in Scripture are extremely lonely. And Jesus himself experienced moments of intense loneliness. On the night before he was willingly going to go to the cross and be put to death in order to create a way for all of humanity to have the ability to enter into eternal relationship with God, he asked a few of his closest friends to come, to wait with him, to sit in his presence and be there with him while he prayed. You guys know what happened? If you're unfamiliar with the story, they fell asleep quickly. And they didn't just fall asleep once, they fell asleep 3 times. He kept going back and waking them up, and then they fell asleep. Jesus experienced loneliness. And then when Jesus died, hanging on the cross, absorbing the consequences of all of humanity's rebellion, not only then, but for all time, the book of Matthew records the following in chapter 27, verse 46. It says this: "At about the 9th hour, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, saying, 'Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani.' That is, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Forsaken means abandoned or deserted. In that moment, Jesus felt all of creation's loneliness and separation from God in a single instant. We are not alone in our loneliness. I believe Jesus not only stepped into history as an extension of God's great love for us, but also to reveal to us how we are to live and engage with one another. As followers of Christ, we are called to be an extension of God's grace and love to the world and communities where we are. This means that we should not only be aware of this loneliness epidemic, but we should be actively working towards bringing light into the darkness. Today, I want to leave you with 3 ways that I believe the life of Jesus gives us a roadmap for how we should respond. Number 1 is this: Jesus allowed himself to be known, and we should too. John 1:14 states, "And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. We have seen his glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth." Dwelt among us. I don't think I will ever be able to fully grasp the way in which God humbled himself by being born into his creation and living among us. But I do know that as a result, we have been given access to the very nature of God in a way that our human minds can understand and comprehend. The 4 Gospels are basically biographies of Jesus. Think about that. He allowed himself to be known so well that not 1 bestseller, but 4 bestseller biographies have been written describing his life. If you have not opened up your heart and entered into relationship with God, oh, you got to do it. It will change your life forever. After service today, and always, we have a prayer room there where people really would love to talk to you about that. There are people sitting here with you and in your family who would love to talk to you about what it looks like to begin to enter into a relationship with our Creator, to be known in a way that you cannot imagine. So, Jesus not only shared his life with people in high moments, but he shared his life with people in low moments as well. People saw him when he was hungry, when he was tired, when he was mourning, and when he was lonely. We're getting ready to start next week our fall life group season. Life groups are environments where people come together and allow themselves to be known. I have witnessed life groups mourn together at the loss of a loved one. I have seen them come around one another at a less than promising medical diagnosis. I have seen them bring them meals when someone maybe loses a job. And I have seen them celebrate together when a baby is born or when a new job is acquired. If you guys are not engaged in this type of community, I would encourage you to do so. It is not only good for our mental and physical health, but our spiritual health as well. You can do that by going online. There's a Help Me Find a Group form, and you just fill that out, and it says, hey, these are the days that I could maybe make some time to connect with people, and then I will help you. Part of my role as a connections minister is get plugged into that. Another thing, later this month, we're doing a men's retreat. It's been a long time that we've done a men's retreat as a church. I'm really excited about it, but this whole thing is being done not because we just love planning things, but because we want to create opportunities for people to connect. And I saved you the embarrassment, and I didn't put the slide up that I had in there, but statistically, we're more lonely than women. And so opportunities like this men's retreat is an opportunity for us to step out, have some fun, laugh a little bit, probably do some silly, humiliating games, but connect with people. The second point I want to tell you is this. Jesus invited people into community, and we should too. Jesus invited people into community, and he met them where they were at. In the Gospel of Matthew, starting in chapter 4, we observe where Jesus begins to call his disciples to himself. He's walking along, it says, the Sea of Galilee, and he calls out to a couple of fishermen, and he says, hey, come, follow me. And they would have known at that moment that if a religious leader was calling to them, it meant drop everything, come and live life with me. Hear me sleep. See how I eat, if I talk with my mouth full or not. But not only that, He invited the fishermen, he invited tax collectors, he invited religious zealots, which, by the way, if you're unfamiliar, the term religious zealot is just a nice way for saying terrorist. It was a strange, diverse group of people that Jesus invited into community with him. The disciples shared meals together, they walked miles together, they lived in community. Jesus also welcomed the marginalized and shared meals with societal outcasts. He spent as much time eating and drinking with others that his critics referred to him as a drunkard and a glutton. Think about that. At Jesus' table, everyone was welcome. Tim Chester, in his book, A Meal with Jesus, stated, "People don't want to be projects. The poor need a welcome to replace their marginalization, inclusion to replace their exclusion, a place where they matter to replace their powerlessness. They need community. They need Christian community." Over the summer, there were several families that gathered together at these things we called connection meals. And what that was is some households opened up their homes to strangers, some to people they knew, and they had a meal, and people came together and for a few hours pushed back some of the loneliness in the world and began to create community. Pastors Jay Pathak and Dave Runyon, in their book, The Art of Neighboring, share about how they gathered together 20 pastors. They're from the Denver area. So they gathered together religious leaders and pastors, and they were going to come together and sort of have this summit about how they could better reach the needs of their community. So they got together, and tell me if any of this sounds familiar to you. They started listing some of the societal problems. It was dilapidated houses. It was elderly living alone. It was child hunger. It was drug and alcohol abuse. And it was extreme loneliness. And after they were having this conversation, by the way, they had also invited the mayor of Denver to come and be part of this. And after they had this conversation and they had talked about these things and the room was quiet, the mayor spoke up and he said this. He said, "The majority of the issues that our community is facing would be eliminated or drastically reduced if we could just figure out a way to become a community of good neighbors." It took the mayor to come together in a group of religious leaders to remind them of the greatest commandment, to say if they wanted to meet the needs of their community, they needed to be good neighbors. In the book of Matthew, in chapter 22, it says that a keeper of the law came up to Jesus. A keeper of the law is somebody who knows Old Testament scripture really, really well. And he asked Jesus, "What is the greatest commandment?" And this is what Jesus said. "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the great and first commandment." But Jesus often gave more information than people were ready for. And he also said, "And the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself." Now, at that time, in that cultural context, neighbor literally meant the people they were living with and around. It wasn't somebody far that they could send money to. It was the people that they were seeing on a daily basis. In Galatians 5:14, Paul reiterates when he writes, "For the whole law is fulfilled in one word. You shall love your neighbor as yourself." If we want to combat the loneliness, we need to become better neighbors, and we need to create more community. The third point I want you guys to leave with today is that Jesus had a heart for the lonely, and we should too. In Luke chapter 19, Jesus intentionally sought out a man named Zacchaeus. Now, if you're unfamiliar of the story of Zacchaeus, I'm going to give you a quick recap here. Zacchaeus was a wee little man, and he climbed a sycamore tree. Okay? But he was also incredibly lonely, you guys. Zacchaeus was a tax collector, which meant more than likely he was stealing from everybody in his community, and they did not like him, rightfully so. But Jesus saw him up in that tree, and he called up to him and said, "Zacchaeus, come down, because I'm going to your house today." And he entered into community with him, and it changed his life forever. In another one of Jesus' biographies, in John, we're introduced to this episode where Jesus interacts with a woman from Samaria, a Samaritan woman at a well. Now, Jesus was Jewish, and at that time, Jewish people did not interact with Samaritan people. But yet, Jesus did. Jesus was not only Jewish, he was a Jewish man, and Jewish men were forbid from interacting with foreign women. Yet, Jesus met her where she was at. Jesus was also a religious leader, and religious leaders at that time would not interact with someone who was deemed unclean or not obeying the moral law. And we learn, and you would learn if you go back and you read this narrative, that this woman had had several husbands and that she was living with someone now who was not her husband. And yet, Jesus met her where she was at. Whether it was Zacchaeus, the woman at the well, Mary Magdalene, or many of the other encounters that are given to us in Scripture, Jesus did not hesitate to meet people where they were at, and he intentionally sought out the marginalized and the lonely. Jesus had a heart for the lonely, and we should too. You know, as a church, we are God's chosen means to address the hurting and the loneliness, not only in one another, but our families, the community, neighborhoods, and the world. We have to start together, and boy, guys, I have been convicted. My title is Connections Minister, and over the last couple of weeks, as I've been diving in and reading, I've been thinking about how I have failed to reach out and connect with the people just in my cul-de-sac. But we have to start actively striving to follow the example of Jesus by allowing ourselves to be known, by creating opportunities for people to find community, and by praying that we will have a heart looking and a heart for the lonely in our world. So while I was preparing this message over the last couple of weeks, I continually had this song that was playing through my head. It's a song by Hillsong United, and it's called Good Grace. But I think it's just powerful in many, many ways. So Travis, I had to twist his arm, but he's agreed to come out and play this. And I just want us to stay, not rush out for a minute, but together, sing this together, read the words, and worship God. Let me pray for us this morning. God, you are so good to us. We praise you and honor you for the way you are community, and that you have created us to be in community with one another. God, we need you to form our hearts and our minds. We need you to inspire us, to show us how we can better open up our lives to one another, how we can better create opportunities for people to enter into community, and how we can ultimately have a heart for the lonely. God, I pray that you would be with anyone in this room who is experiencing a moment of severe loneliness. I pray that you would help them to understand how much you love them and that they are not alone. I pray that you would send somebody their way that could give them hope and encourage them. I pray that we would be, as a church, a light in the darkness. I pray this in your Son, Jesus' holy name. Amen.
Would you stand with me today and sing this with me? People come together, strange as neighbors, our blood is one. Children of every nation, the kingdom come. So let your heart be troubled. Hold your head up high, don't fear no evil. Fix your eyes on this one truth. God is madly in love with you. Take courage, hold on, be strong. Remember where our help comes from. eyes on this one truth. God is madly in love with you. So take courage, hold on, be strong. Remember where our help comes from. Creation, everything with a breath, repeat the sound. All is children, clean hands, pure hearts, good grace, good God. His name is Jesus. Sing wide, all you heavens, let the praise go up as the walls come down. All creation, everything with breath, repeat the sound. This children, clean hands, pure hearts, good grace, good God. His name is Jesus. People come together, strangers, neighbors, our blood is one. Children of generations, of every nation, of kingdom come. And what a great truth today that we can stand on today. Thank you so much for being a part of our service this week. We really hope that this message has touched your heart. If you need prayer, our prayer room is open and available for you. Also, if you'd like to meet some of our staff, you can go to our guest reception room and say hi to us as well. We will see you guys next week.